Welcome to Vampire Divorce with Attorney Clarke Young.
Hey everyone, welcome into an all-new episode of Vampire Divorce with Attorney Clarke Young. I am your host, Mike Leon. Clarke here is a seasoned family law attorney, consultant, expert witness who's been helping attorneys, therapists, and evaluators understand how borderline personality disorder shows up, especially when it comes to custody cases. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about how to build the right team. Clarke's going to walk us through how parents, attorneys, mental health professionals can all work together so the court can actually see what's going on behind closed doors. Clarke, it's good to see you as always in these episodes. Let me ask you, let's get into a borderline case, right? So one that involves a therapist or a custody evaluator. What's the first thing that you've seen in your experience that tends to go wrong in those instances?
Well, the first thing that tends to go wrong once the case is underway and the court is trying to decipher, do I turn right? Do I turn left? What do I do in a case like this? A lot of judges will default to appointing a child custody evaluator. And so the first real battle you fight there is, can you find someone you can recommend to the judge to do the child custody evaluation? The reason this is a problem is that the court is predisposed to saying to parties, when it comes to any kind of experts at all, each of you submit, you have a week, submit 3 names. If you submit a similar name or you can stipulate on someone, I'll take that person. Otherwise, if none of the 6 names match, I'll just appoint one of the 6. And that's how they do it. But that doesn't work in borderline cases because 10 times out of 10, you're going to get someone who isn't qualified. And then you're on a track where you have to hire independent, highly qualified people to do an evaluation, independent evaluation, and then you spend tens of thousands of dollars having the court's expert and your expert fight it out in court. And when that has happened, I have to say that it has always ended badly for the court's expert because the experts that I can get are of such a higher caliber, and then they get to review the work that was done by the usually a marriage and family therapy counselor or marriage counselor or whoever it was, but someone that doesn't have their credentials. And it usually turns out to be quite a waste of time that the court appointed their own expert. So that's the first real hurdle you hit with an expert. The second role are the child's therapist. And there are dozens of scenarios, but let's just take one. The child in the scenario is seeing a therapist who, again, knows nothing about borderline personality disorder. And so my goal as the attorney is to try and get the child into a therapeutic situation where the therapist actually gets what's going on and understands borderline personality disorder. Well, they are few and far between. I mean, even in Los Angeles with, we've got 32 million people in Southern California, it's hard to find a therapist for a child who is actually qualified to do therapy for a child or any other family member in a family that has a borderline. So that's another challenge, to try and get good therapy for the child. Why is that critical? Well, first of all, the child needs a good therapist, but second of all, the child custody evaluator is going to talk to the child's therapist, and if the therapist is fooled by the borderline, which they often are, you're going to get reports to the child custody evaluator that are not accurate. Again, if you are able to, whether the child has a therapist now, or you can get a new therapist, or it's a new case and you're able to appoint, a new therapist up front, you are going to use that day in the life declaration that I talk about, and you're going to give it to the therapist and say, you need to read this. And that day in the life declaration is worth its weight in gold. And gold's way up right now, and it's still worth its weight in gold, because you're going to get that document before anybody and everybody who's a player and an important person in the child's life. It can be the child's extended family, it can be teachers or school counselors, it can be anybody. But everybody's is going to get to see that day in the life declaration, and a lot's going to be based on it. So those are the two main professionals: the child custody evaluator, the child's therapist. If you're in therapy, if your client's in therapy, or if they're still, in some cases, where they haven't even separated yet and they're going to a counselor jointly for marriage therapy, couples therapy, then that's another issue that you have to get involved in. But in terms of the psychologist involved, uh, those are pretty much the key players.
Clarke, let me ask you. We talked about before how sometimes you appear as an expert on these cases as well as an expert witness. When you consult on these cases as well, how do you help that counsel or those evaluators refocus on what's objectively happening, rather than what's being performed, like you've mentioned?
All right. Well, there are two scenarios. One is where I'll get a call from a therapist, a child custody evaluator, someone who's dealing with a borderline family, say. Well, in those cases, if they're in the role of a child custody evaluator, they need to diagnose, they need to say what's going on, and they need to bite the bullet and just run the risk that the borderline is going to sue them or file charges against them with the state licensing board, or doing all those things borderlines do, and that they do, for which they're just infamous. So that's a reality they have to deal with. Otherwise, they shouldn't be in the sandbox, shouldn't be playing, or should have told the judge that they're not qualified to do that evaluation, and the court needs to appoint someone who is qualified and help the court identify and appoint someone who is qualified. I've never seen an evaluator do that, but that's really, I think, their ethical obligation. The second scenario isn't, where you're talking to the evaluator, but you're talking to either the normal range parent who has asked you to come in and coach them. And in some cases, which I've done very successfully and happily, I love these cases, where you have local counsel who's willing to work with me and let me, in essence, be lead counsel when it comes to overall case strategy. And then we work together on structuring the case. I've got tons of materials and samples and templates to use where local counsel can get access to that while I'm coaching local counsel and the client. And in the broadest picture of that, they're going to get that overall strategy, which is critical. I mean, how do you arm wrestle a borderline to the point where they say uncle and they give up, or you get the court to understand what's going on? And lots of these cases, by the way, when you have a court that just can't or won't get with the program, you end up having to get very creative and do things outside of the courtroom to force a settlement. And that's a discussion for another day. But that borderlines can't settle unless, again, they have no power. And so that's really the answer to the question. When you're coaching other attorneys or other parties, you just have to stay with them through the whole scenario, through the whole process, and this can be years.
Yeah. Clarke, let me ask you in that instance, in your experience, what distinguishes then an evaluator who truly understands these cases from somebody who doesn't? We talked about the degrees before, but tell me a little bit about when you've seen this happen, somebody that gets it versus somebody that doesn't.
Well, it's a breath of fresh air when it happens, first of all. And the reality is, when someone identifies and diagnoses one of the parents as a borderline, that report is going to read very differently than otherwise would. And part of that evaluator's responsibility is to make child custody recommendations. And those recommendations will include things like sole legal authority to the non-borderline parent. It will include some sort of a flexibility in the actual parenting plan. They may recommend the appointment. In California, we have what we call parenting plan coordinators, where, again, they are usually mental health professionals, and they're given limited judicial authority to deviate in minor ways from the court order. But they can't go too far because then it's an improper, illegal delegation of judicial authority. So, but they can say, like, oh, they're fighting over the winter holidays, and can we trade a day, or the child got sick and is missing school, or this or that. They can tweak things a little bit, but you still have to go back to court for the modifications to the organic order. In those cases, the order that's going to come from the well-qualified, usually PhD, who's been appointed by the court as the court's expert, the evaluation is going to document in, I would say, different, there would be a different tone and a different mood, if you will, to how it's written. They usually will, like, for example, borderline mothers often will nurse their children till they're age 4 or 5 years old. And they're doing that to make sure the child cannot individuate. And so the child therefore become more and more dependent upon them and not separate and abandon them, which is their greatest fear. So an evaluator might say something like, mother, the child probably should have been weaned at age 2, maybe 2.5, but mothers continued to breastfeed the child because of secondary benefits. All right, that's an actual term that was in an eval. So that's just another way of saying that she's doing it for her own pleasure and gratification. But they won't say that. So you're going to get terms like that. But any judge who's worth his or her salt will be able to read between the lines and know that these behaviors that are being described and the diagnosis and the child custody proposals for the order are being based in a realistic world, not in a make-believe world where the court wants to believe that these are two normal range parents who are just having a disagreement and that they can communicate, and it takes two to tango, it's the sort of thing. So they don't believe in a unilateral conflict, which is what these are. They only believe in bilateral conflicts. Well, you got to get the court beyond that, and that's the role of the psychologist.
Yeah. Clarke, in that instance, let me ask you, what can a parent do when the therapist who's supposed to be helping the child start reinforcing the borderline's parent narrative? So what can a child do when the therapist does that?
That's a difficult question to answer because it depends on the child, depends upon the age of the child. There are normal childhood milestones that children are supposed to meet. And so one of the red flags is when they're not meeting those milestones and they're not autistic or suffering from some other congenital or other physical issue. They'll start having difficulty with social relationships or academic performance and things like that. And they'll become rather obstreperous, and they'll start mirroring the borderline mother's behavior. So those are all warning signs. So honestly, as far as the child is concerned, whether they're in therapy or you're the parent or you're the teacher or anyone involved in the child's life, you have to have the skill set and the courage to help the child understand that while the borderline parent really does love the child, that the borderline parent has much difficulty in expressing and showing that love because the child is always going to feel like they're not enough, they're not good enough, they're not lovable, they're not whatever. They're going to develop major pathologies, and those symptoms will start to show up over time. So, for example, if the child is 11, 12 years old, I would, as a parent, have the child read Christine Lawson's book, Understanding the Borderline Parent. And I recommend to every client I ever had who has a child that they should read that. And if there's a therapist involved, I have my client gift that book to the child's therapist to read and then discuss it with the child. Also, if you have an evaluator who hasn't read the book, they should read it. It's a good introduction to laypersons to borderline personality disorder. Another book which is really good is Walking on Eggshells. I have every client I ever have read that book and the accompanying workbook because it plays that critical role of helping anyone who's in a relationship with a borderline identify the behaviors that are borderline behaviors, and therefore you are in a relationship with a borderline. That has incredible salutary effects across the whole family. I mean, parents, grandparents, siblings, anybody, when they understand what's going on and they have a label for it, then they can deal with it. And the third book I recommend is a PhD book, which most psychologists don't understand. It's called The Borderline Personality, Vision and Healing by Dr. Nathan Schwartz-Salant. I think he spells it S-A-L-L-A-N-T, Salant. And that book discusses how borderlines have been treated throughout history and how they are currently in our literature as vampires. And that's where I came up with this, vampire divorce notion is from that book. I mean, it is absolutely excellent if you can decipher it because he's a Jungian psychologist and it's pretty deep.
Yeah. Clarke, let me ask you as we put a bow on this episode for the attorneys and mental health professionals who they're listening to you right now, they want to handle these cases responsibly. What mindset or education, you just gave them some literature there, but what mindset or education do they need before actually stepping into the court?
Oh boy, is that an incredibly good question. So you're basically asking them to retool, which is a big ask. If assume you have someone that has a PhD, has a successful clinical practice, has dealt with difficult people before. If they haven't dealt with narcissists and borderlines, they're still the wrong person. So you want someone who has experience with narcissists and borderlines, first of all. Once that happens, I think that it's my job as an attorney and the parent's moral responsibility to interview that person and that psychologist and really find out if they know their stuff. And the truth of the matter is, as I've said before, people who haven't been in an interpersonal relationship with borderlines really don't know they exist. They don't really get it. So they don't know what a living hell it is and how debilitating it is to be in a relationship with a borderline. And they don't understand that the survivability rate of children of a borderline parent is very, very low. It's almost, they're doomed, and they're really doomed unless a court will step in and save them. And so, besides maybe giving them a couple of books I just mentioned and quizzing them on their expertise, you've got an uphill battle if they haven't had a clinical practice with borderlines. Now, I will say something else here. It's very important. Most really excellent borderline psychologists and psychotherapists will not get within 100 miles of a family law courtroom because they are not nuts enough to be dealing with people who suffer from borderline personality disorder and try and deal with the broken, dysfunctional family court system. It's too much. So you can see that there's a real difficulty finding people who are willing to actually get involved. I mean, maybe they'll be the child's therapist, but you won't get those same people ever to actually be child custody evaluators. And that's a major, major practice pointer you need to know.
Yeah. Clark, thank you for the time and insights as always on this topic. I truly appreciate it, my friend.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for today's episode of Vampire Divorce. If you want to connect with Clark or reach out to him, do me a favor, visit clarkyoung.com today. Please like, subscribe, leave a review and comment, or share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. As always, I'm Mike Leon. See everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.